Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another interesting and important study with us here at the Church of God International, Jamaica, as we will be looking at tonight, did Jesus really exist? Of course, Christianity, a religion that boasts 2 billion followers, all base their faith on this one premise, or belief, if you want to call it that there was a man living in Jerusalem, living in Palestine 2,000 years ago, referred to as Jesus the Christ. Now, if that is not true, and Jesus is not a historical figure, then that has profound implications for the Christian faith. Therefore, it is important that we undergo this study, because the Bible says we must test all things and prove and hold on to what is good. So my panelists tonight will be none other than Brother Ray Williams, as well as the newly married Brother Jonah Lewis. So welcome, guys, Jonah and Ray. But before we go into this evening's study, we will begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, we come before you, acknowledging you as the Most High, as the Almighty, Sovereign Lord over all lives. Father, we thank you for another opportunity to study things pertaining to life and godliness. And Father, as we open tonight's study, we ask, dear Lord, that you will guide us, that you will guide the discussions, dear Father, that you will lead us, dear Father, into a better understanding, a better grasp, and more faithful adherence to your truth. Father, we pray for all our hearers, dear Lord, that you will also open their minds to hear, to understand, and to search these things, Almighty Father, to see if they are indeed true, to prove whether they are indeed true, so that their faith may be bolstered. This we ask through the precious name of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, and soon coming King. Amen.
Amen.
Now, as I mentioned before, we will be looking at the question of, did Jesus exist? Right? The entire Christian faith is in the balance.
Yeah.
Is on the answer of this one question. And to bring us through tonight's study, I'm going to introduce our main presenter, Brother Ray Williams, a scholar in his own right, to walk us through how we can understand the various perspectives and what are the things that we need to look at to answer this question of whether Jesus did exist. So, Brother Ray, I'm going to turn over to you as you lead us through this evening's study. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Deacon Scale. Good evening, viewers. Welcome to another Bible study. Now, tonight's topic is a very interesting one. Admittedly, before I started researching on this topic, I took it for granted that there was overwhelming evidence that Jesus existed, and therefore there can be no rational argument against the existence of this Jesus. But after researching this topic, I've come to understand why there are so many people who question his very existence, especially when you consider what are some of the historical references for the Bible and the proof of Jesus, and look at what we don't have as Christians and as persons who believe that Jesus did exist. And then finally, we're going to look at what we do have. So to start off tonight, there's a reference that I'll be making from a popular professor. His name is Bart Ehrman. He's a professor of religious studies at UNC, and he's a popular author of a recent book, as recent as 2013, Did Jesus Exist? The Historical Argument for Jesus of Nazareth. That's in 2013. Now, he does a very good job of outlining both positions and the implications of the historical narrative that is there. So I'm going to just introduce what the position actually is so we get a better understanding, and also to highlight the main points. Now, Professor Ehrman states that there is some scholarly and popular views out there that Jesus is a myth. Usually, the skeptical literature speaks to the lack of historical and archaeological evidence about any documents referencing Jesus or any artifacts that have a reference to Jesus. So the skeptics are saying, we usually use history in terms of archaeology, other documents outside of our main source to validate or to revalidate what exists. And they're saying this does not exist for the case of Jesus. They define what is a myth as a story that has no historical basis. They say that it's a history-like narrative, looks like a historical narrative, but it actually did not happen. That Jesus was invented by early storytellers, and that the burden of proof is on persons who believe that Jesus exists to prove it. They're taking the position that we as scholars and scientists say that we don't have the standard of proof that is needed to prove his existence. Now, an interesting thing about Professor Ehrman is that he's agnostic, and he leans more towards the atheist side of the fence. So he's not writing it from a biased perspective as a Christian trying to prove the view of Jesus. So I took that as some credible credentials on his part. So he's saying, listen, I might not believe in the miracles, I might not believe that Jesus is God, but from a historical point of view, we want to first look at, is there a reference to a Jesus of Nazareth? After we have established that existence, then we can debate whether the miracles recorded were true. So he's looking at it from a historical point of view. Can you say that Jesus existed? So I just wanted to make that clear. He's not a Christian. He's actually an agnostic.
Right.
So he outlines the mythist view as I said, that Jesus is a myth based on the lack of historical evidence. There's another lecturer in religious studies. This is somebody who is a mythicist, Raphael Latasta. He does religious studies at the University of Sydney, and he's the author of There Is No God. He claims that the earliest sources of the only reference to Jesus is clearly fictional. He says that the early sources were compiled decades after the alleged event, so nothing was compiled while Jesus was alive or closely after, and it all stems from Christian authors eager to promote Christianity. And he says that it gives us reason to question that there's a clear bias there. He says that the authors of the Gospels fail to name themselves, describe their qualification, or show any criticism where their foundational sources come from. So he's also claiming that it's filled with mythical and non-historical information and heavily edited over time. The Gospels certainly should not convince critics to trust even the more mundane claims made therein. You also have quotes from Richard Dawkins, who says there is a serious historical case to be made that Jesus never lived at all. So those are some of the comments that are out there. Those are some of the views that are out there. And as I said, Professor Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?, outlines the position very well researched. And he also gives the evidence to show from a historical point of view what the contradictions are. Most people would say that this book demolishes his view. So if you have the time, I would highly suggest that you spend the time to read it. So I'm just going to take from the panelists quickly in this first section, your own individual personal views on if Jesus didn't exist, what does this mean for Christianity? And does holding this view, this mythicist view, mean that you're an atheist necessarily? So those are the two questions in your own opinions. I'll start with Jonah first, and then I'll take Deacon Stephen Scale, and possibly any interaction or questions from the audience.
Okay. Good evening, guys. I hope you're hearing me.
Yes, hearing it clearly.
Right. Um, so there's a position that is out there, in Christendom known as Christian atheism. I think I mentioned it before. And Christian atheism basically says, listen, we don't have to believe the things about the miracles. We really don't even have to believe whether or not Jesus existed. We can just take the practical principles of the Bible, the moral things, and we can just work with it. I, for one, reject that. And I reject that on the basis that the Bible itself says, if Christ hasn't risen from the dead, then your religion is in vain, as it were. And that is a serious claim, because the reality is that before we even reach resurrection and all of that, the man first have to be born to die to be resurrected. And if indeed Jesus did not exist, the entirety of Christianity is in vain. And I don't think there is much room for us to say, okay, even though it didn't exist, we might find we can easily just take up the principles and practices. Because the fact of the matter is most of the principles and the practices of the Bible are in other religious texts. And so why put this big emphasis on the Bible if indeed Jesus did not exist? And so the implications are, the stakes are high. And if Jesus did not exist, then Christianity is a waste of time. I guess by extension, for me, religion is a waste of time. But Christianity, in the least, is a waste of time, because all the other moral things, you can get them from other religious texts. So that's, as much as I can say now about it.
Okay, Deacon Scale, in terms of the holding this view, most persons will say, for example, that if somebody holds that view, it means that they are necessarily atheists. But is it possible for you to still believe in a God or have some spiritual leaning, but just leave out the Jesus part, so to speak? And, what are the implications of that?
Yeah, thank you, Brother Ray. I wouldn't go as far as Jonah to throw out religion on a whole if it is proven that Jesus does not exist. My faith first depends on one thing, or I could outline how I develop my faith. I exist, right? I'm here. I find myself here with consciousness, in existence. How did I get here? Right? Why was I born? Why was I created? Right? And to me, the existence of the universe and my ability to perceive it is strong evidence for the existence of God. So I wouldn't necessarily have to be an atheist if the story, the narrative of Jesus Christ being God coming in the flesh on the earth is proven to be historically false. I could still continue to believe in God. Now, whether I believe in the God of the Bible or in the God as articulated by the New Testament, that would definitely be called into question. The entire New Testament scriptures would be called into question. I could still believe in Yahweh.
Okay.
Right. And I could simply say that either the messianic prophecies are misunderstood or they just have not been fulfilled as yet. I could continue to hold that position, and I certainly don't need to throw out the principles, but certainly Christianity as we know it rests on this fundamental fact, whether Jesus Christ, that is the Son of God, came in the flesh, lived, died, and most importantly was resurrected. Because as Jonah said, I echo his words as well, as he echoed Paul's words, if Jesus was not risen from the dead, then your belief in Christ, not necessarily in God, your belief in Christ and in that hope for your redemption from the dead is certainly futile. But I wouldn't necessarily consider someone who doesn't believe in Jesus Christ as necessarily being a atheists, as we define atheists, meaning not believing in the existence of.
Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, I agree with the sentiments that Deacon Scale would have put forward in terms of you can still have some semblance of believing in a supernatural being, but not necessarily believing in the existence of Jesus. I see a comment here from Jeremy saying that Jesus is the foundation of the Bible. If he didn't exist, we can throw out the Bible because all laws and prophets point to him. And I think your point, Stephen, would have countered that a little bit in terms of saying that you don't have to throw out all the laws. There might be a misunderstanding on the interpretation of, the prophecies and what's supposed to happen in terms of the Messiah. I'm going to move on to section.
Hard to.
Go ahead.
I was saying to Jeremy's credit, I think that's a bit hard to do because and I try to be not as arrogant, but for me, I think it is virtually when you consider all the text of the Old Testament and all the prophecies that relates to Jesus or the Messiah coming, it is virtually impossible that it can be fulfilled any other way except in Jesus Christ, because there were certain timelines that needed to be met. There were certain certain dates that were needed to be met, certain prophecies that existed that could only be fulfilled at that specific time and in that specific person. And it's very hard to, well, I say hard, but virtually impossible to see that it can be fulfilled any other way except through Jesus. So to Jeremy's credit, when we say that all the laws point to him, we don't just say it just, in terms of a spiritual or a feel-good type of thing. It's a deep theological thing. The entire Bible was written about this coming man setting up this kingdom. So that's just to add to what Jeremy said. But I do respect the views that Scale had.
Yeah, and I think it also goes back to the point that some Christians, they would say that not even Christians, some Bible followers then would say that they don't necessarily hold to the New Testament, but they hold to the Old Testament. And therefore, a lot of the biblical references to Jesus' existence comes in the New Testament. But if I'm an Old Testament Christian and I don't deal with New Testament, I believe that the New Testament was corrupted or it was false. It doesn't really put me down the side of atheists. And I'm not throwing out the laws either. But I do understand what you're saying in terms of it would be very hard to look at the fulfillment and dismiss them, just like that.
Right, and to add to that, Ray, or to interact with what Jonah said, not to belabor this point too much, I know we have quite a bit to get onto, but even the recognition of the fulfillment of the prophecies as they are recorded in the Gospels and in the New Testament, they retrospectively look back and fit Jesus into the Old Testament narrative, right? and they mold it into that. We believe that they are correct, right? But if Jesus did not exist, then certainly our understanding, our interpretation of even the times could be certainly different. I mean, look at the Jews, for example. They that the Messiah has come, because a lot of the Messianic prophecies remain unfulfilled. They did not see his coming in two parts. So it could be quite possible, and again, just saying, if Jesus did not exist, that we could have a future Messiah coming in one go that would fulfill the prophecies, and perhaps our understanding of prophecies like Daniel 9 and Isaiah 53 could be understood or actualized in another way. So that is what I mean when I say it. Yeah.
All right. So moving on to section 2. This one is entitled, Why Not the Bible Though? And I just want to state something. So although for tonight's Bible study, we can't go into the Bible necessarily, we still want to look at some of the archaeological facts around the Bible to let us see what the historical evidence is, and also to examine the position that the mythicists put forward that the Bible is not credible. So first off, I'm going to tell you what they say about the New Testament Gospels. Now, point number one is that they make the case that there's no historian that lived at the time of Jesus' existence. So when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written, we know that there are 4 different vantage points of the same historical event or alleged historical event. At the same time, they're saying that Mark came first and Matthew, Luke, and John followed Mark. So therefore, there was one storyteller who started out the story, and then the other 3 just basically picked up on what was being said to cement the narrative. So that's point number 2. So number 1, no historian lived at the time of Jesus that we can reference outside for to confirm these new gospel or New Testament scriptures. And secondly, that Mark came first and the other 3 were followers of Mark. Now, I'm going to quote some facts that we can look at. So there is a source biblical archaeological report, and this was a commentary by Brian Windle early last year, February 15th, 2019. He wrote an article called The Earliest New Testament Manuscripts. And what he does is he documents quite nicely the different papyrus fragments that exist today, the dating of those papyrus fragments, and also where they're located and some of the scripture references that are there. So first off, we have P and P104. Those are the Sackler papyrus fragments. They're housed in the Sackler Library, the papyrology room at the University of Oxford in England. And those are the some of the two earliest manuscripts that they have, fragment pieces. Now, P90 or Papyra P90 is a reference system for papyrus fragments. P90, they say, contains scriptures of the Gospel of John, right, chapter 18, 36, and to chapters 19, verse 7. Right. They also state that P104, which is a second fragment piece, has Matthew 21, 34 to 37. Now, based on the dating of these fragments, they put them to 2nd century writing, which means that this would have happened or been compiled significantly in terms of years after Jesus died. So certainly after 100 AD, we know that Jesus lived around 30 to 33 and a half AD. We definitely see that these texts date to after 100 AD. So this is at least 70 years after Jesus died that this writing would have been in there. The second thing to note is that these are copies of copies. So they're not originals, but they're copies of copies. But nonetheless, the timing of the copy is very important. The other fragment is P52. That is the Ryland Papyrus fragment. That is on location on display on John Rylands University Library in Manchester, in the United Kingdom. Now, this one is the earliest and the most famous Greek New Testament manuscript that there is today. And it was translated in 1934 by C.H. Roberts. Now, at the time, when they found this papyrus and translated it, they sent it for carbon dating. And they said that the date of this papyrus was close to about 100 to 150 AD. And it contains writings or texts from John 18, 31 to 33. So that is the Ryland Papyrus, the P52 reference number for papyrus fragments. So this is some archaeological evidence talking about the Bible. So although, yes, Mark came first, and although, yes, they're putting forward the case that the other Gospels followed Mark, from your view, panelists, the significance of the dating being so close to Jesus, what does that mean to you, although it's a copy of a copy, especially in your understanding in terms of how historical text and the copies being so close to an event? What are the implications for you? And is this a strong point? Is this a weak point? Although this is a biblical narrative, and we'll go outside of that shortly. I'll take Deacon Scale first and then Jonah after, as well as any comments from the audience.
The challenge that we have in the 21st century is that when we consider things that would have happened historically, we, based on our contemporary experience, seem to forget that it was a whole lot more difficult to record things back in that time and to have them last for a very long time. For example, the quality of the paper, quality of keeping the records, and that sort of thing. So the papyrus and so that the original manuscript would have been written on would have been so fragile. They had to be preserved by copying before they would have just decayed, right? So that was normal for that particular time. Scholars would tell you that historically, or in terms of what constitutes valid historical records, the time frame between the happening of the events and the recording of the events is usually anything within 200 years would be considered fairly accurate and acceptable, right? So the fact that we have documents, yes, I said the date of the preserved manuscripts are from the 2nd century. That in and of itself falls within the accepted timeline that historians generally accept records as being acceptable. So that to me is actually evidence that helps to support the validity of the records. The claim that the authors pulled from the central source being Mark and basically replicated, I think when you look at the gospel accounts themselves and you see you can see the clearly different perspectives, you can see the clearly different, I would even say, objectives and point of views that the various authors have. So it is not necessarily true that they pulled from the same sources. Now, there's also the point that I made that the authors fail to identify themselves, and that really persons just came and ascribed authorship to the various personnel that are the titles that the Gospels currently carry. No, I mean, Jonah can probably speak a bit more to that, but these persons claim are the way that they recorded, the perspective that they recorded it from. So in the case of Matthew, and in the case of John is much later. Well, John is purported to be much later. They are claimed to be eyewitnesses who were with him, who were recording the events from their perspective. Luke, of course, said he carefully went and examined and would have checked with various persons who were eyewitnesses. Of course, Mark would have been in and around at the time that Jesus was here, right? So these writings, even though they would have been perpetuated by copying and carrying on, that was out of necessity because the writings just could not hold up. Another point before I turn over is that at the time of these events, persons were not necessarily of the mind to record what was happening in written form. This was playing out before their very eyes. It is only sometime after when they realized that, hey, the promise end times or so was not going to happen in the time that they thought it was going to. And then they started to write and preserve this sort of account. But at the time, they were not of a mind to record it. It's not like Jesus was some sort of, I mean, we know that Jesus is a king, right? But it's not like a Caesar who would have scribes dedicated to recording all the events of his life and all that sort of thing, right? Jesus was a poor man. Nobody was thinking that, hey, I need to write down what this man is doing. Right? They were just, most of them were in the poor class. They were just going about their day-to-day business. Yes, Jesus had this great message. Yes, he was doing miracles and so forth. But they were not of a mind to write that down and to preserve it. They were really caught up in the moment. And it's only long after they really say, hey, perhaps we realized we're dying. It was spreading, it was really verbalized, it was spreading word of mouth. And then it's really, after a while, they realized that, hey, we probably need to put this thing down. So, I mean, we need to take ourselves out of our 21st century, kind of put ourselves back in the events and see what is going on and how it is that this thing would possibly have been recorded.
Okay. Thank you for that point. And I think noteworthy of some of the things that you said is the objective of the different gospel writings. So, for example, we know in Matthew, for example, there's a long historical genealogy that is laid out there versus that would have been in Mark, obviously for a different purpose, and obviously a narrative and a detail that was not present in Mark. And so we see that there are different parts of the story that are there. So that is, for me, that is very comprehensive and compelling. That, you have 4 different eyewitness accounts that are compiled together, trying to go through. And I think the point also that you made about Luke is very important in terms of Luke himself being a historian and would have gone through the process of verifying history, also writes down his conclusions and would have gone on. Jonah, you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. Just to kind of pick up from the point that you guys were saying about how persons would have said that there was a single source, Mark, and then the other writers would have borrowed from it. And I just to kind of, in my mind, show how ridiculous that is, or for want of a better word, how not very honest, because when you think about how, as you guys have mentioned, the serious notable differences that are there, outside of saying that, different perspective, different persons giving their own account of it, but the notable differences to the extent that one of the reasons why people reject the Bible is because contradict themselves. They contradict each other. And so I hope you get the point I'm trying to make, that to say that they are pulled from a single source and at the time they contradict themselves, as many persons who reject the Bible would claim, then I don't think you can eat a cake and have it at the same time. But to get into the meat of it, I mean, when you speak to most persons and when people ask about, what are the non-Christian sources, what are the how do we know that these things are reliable? And but we can realize a misconception that modern people have about what the New Testament is and how did it develop. And I think it's important that we root that out first. And because the idea is that somehow the New Testament is a single book written by Christians, and it's somehow unreliable and it's uncredible. But if they argue, if there were some kind of evidence outside of that book, then that would definitely be real evidence. But the reality is that is actually a misconception. That is actually about a misconception about what the New Testament actually was. And lay people need to understand that there really, and Scale alluded to the point, there really was no such thing as a New Testament. The New Testament was not assembled into a single volume. There was no New Testament until a couple hundred years after Jesus' death. And you have to think about them as being separate, single, independent documents in the Greek language, coming down from the first century. There were gospels, there were letters to the churches, there were history of the churches, there were apocalyptic writings, and all these independent documents handed down, on this story about this man, Jesus of Nazareth. Not even Jesus of the Christ, but Jesus the Christ, but Jesus of Nazareth. And what the church actually did was that they gathered the earliest of these documents and the most reliable of them. Because the fact of the matter is, there were counterfeits running alongside them. The reality is that not all the things that we see in the Bible today are all the books that were being tossed around. There were some Gnostic gospels that were out there. And so what the church did I guess you can say it's pick out, on an historical sense, what they considered to be the most reliable of them and the earliest of them, and put them under one covering called the New Testament. And so that by the very nature of that case, the earliest and the most reliable source for the life of Jesus are actually found in the New Testament. And so to ask what evidence is there outside of the New Testament and to discount the New Testament evidence itself is to prefer secondary derivative sources to the earlier primary sources, and that is really just simply what you say, bad historical methodology. And so the question we should be asking is, yes, whether or not we need extra biblical books, and they would confirm what is said in the Bible, but how credible are these documents? How credible is the New Testament, and not whether or not we need extra biblical books. But if we examine the New Testament books for what they really were, not as inspired texts, not as holy texts, which they came to be, but simply independent manuscripts, simply independent accounts handed down to us out of the first century about this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And I believe that if we use the canons of historical inquiry, I believe they come away looking good as a historical source for the life of Jesus. And as I said earlier, these sources, these New Testament sources, are not contradicted by extra biblical sources, but they are actually confirmed. So I think it's important that when we think about New Testament, not to think about them as we have them now, but as separate, independent writers writing. And so that I think that does have a great impact on the reliability and the historicity of Jesus according to the New Testament.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Jonah. Just also want to point out for the audience that there are other papyrus references. For example, you have P66, which is the Gospel of John. You can look that up in your research time, and that has been dated towards the 2nd and the 3rd century in terms of copies. You have papyrus P77, Gospel of Matthew, that also can be dated to the 2nd to 3rd century. Papyrus 103, Gospel of Matthew, also in Greek, can be dated to 2nd, 3rd century. So there are other papyrus fragments that we have from different time periods that are copies. And I think the point that is being made from a lot of persons who defend the Bible as a historical source is that there's over 5,800, I think, Greek manuscripts or copies. And there is relatively little difference between the copies that are made. So if you have the copies out there that are being made, we have valid testing that can take us up to at least 600, 700 to 1,000 years in terms of validity. We can say at least the copies with little change would have existed in the 100 or the first 200 years after the birth of Jesus. So, in terms of reliability, and I think Deacon Scale would have made this point earlier, in terms of the procedure to go through and validate historical documents and the time periods in which they reference and which you can date them back to, that is definitely a very strong indicator. But I don't want to stay on this point because the quest for tonight is really to look at what we don't have outside of the Bible, and also what are some of the things that we do have inside of the Bible, outside of the Bible. I'm going to take a couple of comments before we move on from the chat. So I have one here from Sean Goldburn saying, how can we trust these documents being displayed to be accurate? So Sean, I think we would have gone through that a while ago in terms of the carbon dating that has been done. Also, the reference points to when these documents existed. The papyrus paper itself can give you a relatively good date. You have the other manuscripts that are copied out there, the over 5,800 copies that these papyrus fragments match up to as well. And with all the copies, we see little degrees of variances. So I think that is pretty accurate, and you can consider them trustworthy. Remember that there are copies of copies and not the original. A next comment from, Sean again. We see various inaccuracies listed in history for various reasons. Example, so-called facts about Napoleon, Benjamin Franklin, etc., which were written years after and are found to be inaccurate today. And Sean, I know that point. I'll get back to that point in section 3 when we talk about what we don't have, the implications. for not having certain things. And we'll bring up some of the references that you would have made. I think I saw a point from Jordan. Okay, so I'll leave it there and I'll move on to section 3. We'll talk a little bit about what we don't have. So we've discussed the Bible, what we have, what the historical references are, what it means to the implications of credibility. And what I want to talk about now is, for most Christians, what we should realize that we don't have. So coming back to some of those procedures that Deacon Scale would have referenced before, there's some actual things that are missing. And, when you read what is missing, at first it might be very alarming because, as lay persons who are not historically trained or persons who don't have archaeological experience, you would say, for sure, these things should exist. If Jesus was such a wide-known character, so much miraculous things, so much people knew about him, certainly somebody must have taken his birth paper, took a picture of his birth paper. And we're so accustomed to Google now as well. You can literally Google people's age and you can find all this information about them, pictures from when they were younger. So the thought process is that if Jesus was so influential, surely we should have other references. So now I'm going to go through what Christians don't have. Some people might find this alarming, but nonetheless, you have to contend with what is presented. So just some facts here for you. So Pastor Horain Smith, in his presentation last year, Feast of Tabernacles, he did a presentation on, can we find evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible? He notes some things that we don't have in his assessment. And when I was researching it, it was very shocking. So he says, history is based on facts that can be substantiated or proven. If there's no biblical evidence outside the Holy Bible, disregarded by many as just a mere collections of writings that could be fictional, then the Jesus of history is not real. Some theologians and historians have concluded that thought. He said, for many, finding evidence for the historical Jesus is elusive. Therefore, they cannot accept he was on earth or even existed. So he has outlined some of the skepticisms. So these are some of the things that we don't have. We don't have, and we know, for example, from a lot of other historical sources, that the Romans are good keepers of historical documents. So what we don't have, it says here, there are no Roman records that show Pontius Pilate crucifying a man named Jesus. So that would have been significant. The so-called Jews of the king being crucified. There's a definite political struggle there. There was such a political struggle that would cause the upheaval of the Jewish persons to revolt or to start a war. Certainly, there must be some record of such a persecution. So there's none of that there. He also notes there's no works of carpentry, no manuscripts, no court records, no eyewitness testimony, no official diaries, no birth records, no accounts of his trials, no reflections on his significance, no written disputes about his teachings from that early time. There's none of that there as well. And none of that existing outside of the Bible, at least. There are no clear artifacts or self-written manuscripts of Jesus Christ lived as a human being. No historian who lived when Jesus was alive who could have written about his existence and authenticate that he lived on earth. All the documents we have about Jesus came after he died. None of the original manuscripts exist, and we only have copies of copies. So you see some very, what would seemingly be some strong points here about the lack of evidence. Now, Sean brought up a point, and I just want the panel's view on this. He pointed out that there are other popular historical figures that we have heard about, Napoleon, for example, where we see what would have been historical fact in one place. We see that they're inaccurate, but people say that Napoleon existed.
Right.
For sure that he existed. You have other persons who have less historical evidence about them, but we accept that these people existed. So I think, in our earlier discussion about Professor Herman, he was saying he does not necessarily believe in the miracles, but he does at least accept that there is a man called Jesus from Nazareth who was crucified. So, the fact that we don't have these things, does this dent your faith, or does this beg any questions from you personally? What are your views on that? I'll take Jonah and then Deacon Scale.
So let me just add one more interesting point. If you should just quickly Google or Wikipedia Jesus's birth date or birth year, you will see it said that Jesus was born 4 years BC, 4 years before Christ, and you wonder how does that make sense if indeed Jesus is the Christ, or how can he be born 4 years before himself? But I think if what is said is true, I mean, there are some points that you made. If what you said is true, it does have an implication on the man we know to be Jesus. But I think it's very important that we separate some things when we're talking about the historicity of Jesus and Jesus' life. And it's slightly funny, and I know I said it to you on Sabbath Way. Jesus' existence is slightly different than his miracles, all the things that he, the Bible claims that he has done. And so I think it was Carl Sagan, late Carl Sagan, famous astronomer, physicist, said that, listen, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so if we want to prove the resurrection of Jesus, we need some extraordinary evidence for that. But the reality is that this is not the same thing. It's easy to put all the things, all the events of Jesus, all the things that he did, the miracles, and tie them up in whether or not Jesus himself existed. And I don't think they are one and the same thing. And it's a very important point to be made that, as I said, if all the canons of history are met, I mean, it can raise some questions in people's mind that if a lot of these things did not exist, then can we even trust that such a person existed? But the reality is that you need not all those things. You need not all those things to say that such a thing about a man existed, because I can easily say, let's say, John Brown lived. And I can very much accept that, yes, a person named John Brown existed. And that is separate and apart from saying that John Brown was the first president or the third president of the United States of America. So I think there is really, I think there is also an anti-Christian, there is also an anti-Jesus bias that is sometimes sprinkled in the mix. Because if I think it was C.S. Lewis that said it, listen, you have to accept some things about Jesus. You can, is either he's a madman, is either what he did was true, is either he was mad, he was this, he was that. I'm not remember the exact thing. I think Skid can pick it up for me. But you cannot have all of them at the same time. You have to accept that in the least he lived and he did the things that he did. Again, while a slightly separate point, but in the minimum, I think it can be established that such a man, let me say, could have existed, if that's okay. But that's separate from saying that he did all the things that he did. But at the same time, I see how they can be inextricably linked, because the things that is said about Jesus are the things that relates to his miracles. Because I mean, think about the 12 years of his life. Well, the missing years of his life that person always talk about. What happened during those 12 years? We just hear from one miracle to the next miracle. He was born miraculously. This miraculous thing happened at his birth, and then we hear him start doing some miracles, preaching again. So definitely some things are questionable, but at the point of him being an historical person, I don't need to see the birth certificate of a man named John Adams to just accept blindly that John Adams existed. I don't think that's necessary. I mean, the extraordinary things might, for me, raise an alarm. I think Scale probably can help me out a bit with that.
Yes, Deacon Scale.
Yeah, indeed, Jonah. I agree with your sentiments. We can separate for purposes of determining validity the fact of his historical existence and versus the claims that is made. And I just want to share some perspective here. I don't think anyone will dispute that Julius Caesar existed, right? A man called Julius Caesar, Emperor of Rome. Yeah. And that's what, this is very important. Let's look at the context of this. So, the New Testament has 24,000 copies. They talk about copies of manuscripts and so forth. 24,000 existing copies, right? And if you look at the amount of time, the years between the original writing and the earliest surviving copies, Ray, you mentioned that you have some from the second century. It's really between 40 and 70 years. The time gap between the current existing copy and the time that it was supposedly written. So that's 40 to 70 years, at the time of a generation, a lifetime. 24,000 existing copies in total. That's the New Testament. For Julius Caesar, who no one disputes his existence, there are 10 existing copies of documents referring to Julius Caesar. And the date between the copies that are surviving today and the actual events is 1,000 years. 1,000 years, a millennium. So the point I'm making is that there are far more copies of the New Testament, and the New Testament writers are much closer to the events than widely accepted historical facts, like the existence of Julius Caesar, who writings date between the copies and the manuscript and the original writings 1,000 years, and just very few surviving manuscripts. So a person's, and I think Jonah mentioned it, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof and evidence. But it is very, I think skeptics put a lot of undue pressure, let me put it that way. Not say pressure, but unfair criteria for verifying the historicity of the New Testament and of the Gospels and of Jesus' existence that they do not put to other sort of writings, right? So that is what I would say about that.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Deacon Scale. And I would risk of me not to also make the point from their position that although there seems to be this writing around this character, you can't also ignore the fact that this character seems to share certain story characteristics of other pagan characters. The virgin birth, for example, the references to son of God, for example, Adonis. So they say sometimes that these stories about Jesus were even borrowed from these other religions. So, that is also something I know that people contend with, say, how reliable can you trust a story? Because there are so many other stories out there that seem similar. So, very good points, Deacon Scale and Jonah, about the narrative of persons who existed by historical standards, Julius Caesar being one of them. 1,000 years after his life, you have 10 copies of any reference to him, but for Jesus being more close to the time, and also in terms of variety, and also in terms of the number of documents existing. But we still can't have a case for Jesus. We can have one for Julius Caesar, but not one for Jesus, I'm thinking at this point, if we're using that system to validate Julius Caesar, we can at least, an atheist can at least say, And that's why I like Professor Ehrman's point. He can at least say that there was a Jesus that existed. I'm not sure about the miracles part, but I can at least say that there was a man called Jesus, if we're supposed to be using historical and archaeological standards. So, go ahead, Jonah.
No, I wanted to interact briefly with the point you made about other religions and the similarities between Christ, at least the story that is told about Jesus and the other saviors of the religion. And I think one of the easiest ways Christians would answer that is by saying simply, look, the devil is the greatest deceiver. And so the devil would have gone through history and put up prototypes of, what the real Jesus is supposed to be and put elements that seems very much close to the real thing. In addition to that, I think we must also caution ourselves when we say that the Bible copied from these other texts, because it is not the same thing to say that a religion predated Christianity and to say that that religion's practices and beliefs predates that of Christianity. In other words, sometimes what you'll find is that religion and even in Christianity, because what we, in the Church of God understand Christianity to be, is really to be, for viewers, don't come and stone me. What most church practice as Christianity today is not what the early church, the true original apostles had as Christianity. And I say that to say that over time, religions evolve and they change and adapt to other surrounding religions. And so, for example, a religion, say Mithraism, you might have that religion that dates earlier than Christianity itself, but at the same time, certain elements about, him being the Son of God were not there. Those elements that seem very parallel and similar to the Christ event, the Christ story, was not there earlier until after Christianity came about and came predominant. And some people say, look, clearly, at the end of the day, we are here in 2020. There's a religion that was Mithraism that existed 1,000 years before Christianity. And when we read about Mithraism, this is what it says. And obviously, Christianity borrowed from it, which sometimes is not necessarily the case. In many cases, it is the other way around. It's just that Christianity spread, and so the other religions actually started to borrow from them, even though those religions came earlier. So we kind of have to caution ourselves with that.
Well, Jonah, at a later time, I'm going to challenge you to show some of those references, especially from a historical point of view, where we can see definitively that some of these other things would have borrowed, and it's not the other way around in terms of the dates.
Sure.
Deacon Scale, I'm going to throw one out from the audience too. Cleveland Mason made a comment, and I just wanted to see how you're interacting with this one. The disciples or apostles wouldn't die for a man who never existed. How do you interact with something like that, especially from the other side? What would be their response to something like that?
Okay, well, I think personally it is an excellent point, Cleveland Mason, that you made. And in fact, a recent presentation that I did, I made that same point as one of the strong evidence for Jesus' resurrection, that they would not be, so many people would not be willing to die for something that they knew was false. And that I think is one of the strong circumstantial evidence for Jesus' existence and his resurrection as well. I'm not quite sure how the skeptic would counter that. One of the views I've heard is that it's delusion. Persons were deluded. They really believed, they thought that he existed. So even though they cannot challenge the person's convictions, they said that, boy, they were really, they were deceived. They were fooled. Right? But so many people, such a strong conviction is very compelling evidence for the existence of Jesus and even his resurrection.
So what about the case, for example, Muslims? We have so many Muslims, especially in the Middle East right now, that they die professing a jihad, for example. They believe in a caliphate, so to speak, that will come and call a jihad, a religious war, that will also bring about the end. We see them dying for a purpose and a cause. So, how would you make the distinction between that? Because Christians would say that Muslims are false or believing in something that is wrong, but they still die for a purpose. Any take us on that?
Well, again, looking at it from an existential point of view, right? We're looking at this as potential evidence of Jesus' existence, right? These are contemporaries of Jesus we're talking about. People such as Peter, Paul, James, his brother, who are giving up their life. So what we may say that perhaps they were deluded in their faith in him or faith in God and so forth. But we certainly, I think it's strong substantial evidence. The fact that they're so close to Christ and willing to give up their lives, I think is strong. So that closeness, I think, would be a difference. Right? I don't know if Jonah have anything to add to that, but I think the fact that they were so close to that would substantiate. Because if he didn't exist, think about it. All right, look at the opposite scenario. If he did not exist, right, then them professing and dying as a result of professing this Christ would not make much sense.
Okay, point taken there. All right, so so main points from this section is that when we do compare the historical evidence to other persons, yes, we don't have certain things, but we also don't have these same things for other people. And where we take some historical characters as valid, we certainly do have more evidence or more compelling evidence for Jesus than even Napoleon in my thought. So certainly if we're going to be looking at a skeptical method of historical validation, we'd first have to throw Napoleon before we even reach Jesus. So for us, that is some things that we need to research. Yes, we want to prove Jesus, but if we're looking at other persons out there and we see the moral requirements for historical validation, then if we're using that same standard, we can definitely say that Jesus existed. I want to move on now to stronger points, and I'll list out some of these other sources, and I want the feedback from the audience as well as from the panelists on the strength of these particular points. So Pastor Horain Smith in his presentation, also going in line with what Professor Ehrman would have said, does highlight some cases of persons outside of the Bible who definitely do reference a Jesus and gives us some historical context. The first one, and I'll start off with this, a lot of persons don't like this reference because it's so close to Christianity. The Jewish historian Josephus, and we use Josephus's historical accounts to kind of get a picture of what was going on closer to the times of the expulsion of the Jews, or what happened shortly after Jesus died. And he would also have given us certain biblical context for even John the Baptist and what would have happened there in that time. Now, we need to ensure that we hammer home the point that Jews and Christians, although they come from an Abrahamic faith, Jews don't necessarily believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Some of them think of him as a prophet, as a man with good things, but not necessarily the Messiah. So when we look at Jewish historian writings, we can definitely say that might not be a bias towards Jesus, so to speak, and this was more from a historical reference. So Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, in his work Jews in Antiquities, and some quick facts about Josephus. He was born in 37 AD, which was very close to when Jesus would have existed, approximately 5 years after. He would have been born 4 to 5 years after. So growing up as a child in that environment, surely he would have been exposed to the stories about this Jesus. And as he got older, closer to the time, just like how we know about Elvis Presley, or even some persons who would have died by the time we grew up, he would have a good account or a good source of witnesses or other historical time references at his time to write down. So he wrote the Antiquities in 93 AD. He was born in 37 AD. And what would be very interesting is if Josephus starts to reference anything about a man called Jesus or anything that would have happened to him. So in book 18 of the Antiquities, which covers the actions of Pilate, we have some references here where Josephus quotes, he drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, referenced mean to or called the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. So Josephus here makes a reference to somebody called the Christ, who is drawing Greek followers as well as Jewish followers. So Josephus notes that. Additionally, in book 20 of the Antiquities, we have another reference from Josephus where he notes here that the council of judges was assembled and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them of as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned. So once again, we have another historical reference. One claiming that there was a Jesus, the so-called Christ, but even more validity is the fact that he has a brother named James, which we know corresponds with the Gospels as well, and the book of Acts. So we do see some historical reference by Josephus, who is a Jew, not necessarily any allegiance to the Christian faith, so to speak, but just a historian in Jewish right. And here he's making reference 2 times to James as well as Jesus, calling James the brother. Now, there is a little bit of controversy around this particular text. Some of the mythicists will say that the writings of Josephus was tampered with and certain things were inserted at a later stage, and therefore we can't fully trust it. So there is a particular author, I think his name is John P. Meir, spelled M-E-I-E-R, that's his last name. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce it correctly. But it says that in his reconstruction of the text with his purported Christian insertions, Pastor Horan Smith highlights that if we were supposed to remove the texts that were added, so the texts that were added were, if indeed one should call him a man, that was one reference that was added out of the entire paragraph, that was only line. He was the Messiah, that was also added, those 4 small words. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as the fine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. So that was also an added line. But Pastor Horan Smith is saying, if you take the works of Josephus, the original documents, you remove these inserted texts, what you're still left with is that there was somebody called the Christ, and there was somebody who was known as James, that was his brother who was crucified. So if you take away the messiahship or the different acts that was inserted by John Meir, then you're still left with a significant amount of historical scripture that says that there was a Jesus that existed. So that is the references from Josephus. Also, we have another scholar, Professor Feldman. And Feldman is the author of Josephus and Modern Scholarship from between 1937 and 1980. He notes that of 52 scholars studying Josephus's writings, 39 found portions of the first reference to be authentic, meaning that without the additions, 39 other scholars found that these writings were authentic, which means that we have a verified source outside of the Bible, outside of Christianity, that does reference a man called Jesus. Any thoughts on that, panelists? And I'll take any comments from the audience.
Yeah, just briefly, I think it is very noteworthy. I mean, I would even agree with the skeptics that if indeed those things were added, then it would bring into question the validity of Josephus' word, because at the end of the day, Josephus, if he has declared that Jesus is the Christ, he is the Messiah, we have not seen where Josephus was converted. He remained a Jew, and so it brings in some question that the validity of his text. But the reality is that it were not so, and we can easily remove those things, and if we still accept Josephus' words. And remember, again, this man is not a Christian, just like in our contemporary time, Bart Ehrman is not a Christian, and not and when you think about it, think about the staunch relationship that, I mean, early Jews would have against Christians. And I'm not trying to push any anti-Semitic things, but there was such a staunch relationship between Jews and Christians, because Christians to the Jews were pagans, bastards, and all of that. And so when you think about how, putting all that aside, Josephus writing this thing about the man, Joseph being an historian, doing his historical work as he should, still found it being a part of his integrity to ensure that, Jesus' historicity is maintained. I think it's very important. Additionally, I want to go out on a limb and say, even the miracles of Jesus is not as extraordinary as many persons would put it out to be, especially in light of what persons' mindset were at the time, because miracles were really not new to people at that time. People back then really saw miracles and really saw, at least the miracles or witchcraft or whatever you want to say. It was for them was a common phenomenon. So even the miracles that we profess Jesus to do is not so out of reach. But the fact that you can have persons still accepting, and Josephus can still come together and say, listen, this man existed outside of what he has done, outside of his miracles. His miracles could have been works of the devil, as the Pharisees said, but at the same time, his historical identity is still intact. The man, Jesus of Nazareth, and we stress Jesus of Nazareth over Jesus the Christ. And I think Josephus' writing is very important, and I think just as much as we would say about Bart Ehrman's writing. And frankly, I find it more compelling, and I guess it's just me, when a non-believer would accept or accede that such points in our stories are true, rather than, one of our own, because definitely there is a bias thing that would probably be inserted. So Josephus' writing is a big thing in terms of the reliability, the historicity of Jesus' existence.
And Deacon Scale, any comments?
Let me comment briefly on the accusation that the text Antiquities were corrupted by persons with a Christian agenda. Now, the writing in book 18, that one is definitely more controversial, because as I think you pointed out, Ray, and Jonah pointed out, Josephus is making some elaborate claims about Jesus being the Christ raised on the third day, and he didn't profess changing from Judaism to Christianity. He did believe that, as that text seemed to suggest, then he would definitely, you would have seen where he would have converted. So that one is disputed. But as I say, you can strip away the additions and still take from it that there was some mention of Christ. But I think the other one, book 20, that one is much That one is very compelling. Because note this, there's a passive reference to Christ. He was not writing about Christ. He was writing about the actions of the high priest and Ananias.
Right.
So he mentioned it in passing as if he accepted it as a historical fact.
Yeah.
Right? And in fact, it was James that he was talking about. Jesus' brother. He said, Ananias crucified, killed, put to death. James, who was the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. So that one seems a lot more authentic. Because he said, who was called the Christ. Not necessarily showing personal belief, but this was how Jesus was known historically at the time. Jesus was so his passive reference here suggested that Jesus was well known at the time of his writing. It was an accepted historical fact that there was someone called Jesus the Christ, and Josephus' passive reference to that is great. And again, his reputation as a historian was beyond doubt, beyond question. And all the Greek manuscripts, the early manuscripts of Josephus' writing, doesn't show any tampering. Certainly for book 20, they are very consistent. And the passive reference suggests that it was accepted that Jesus was a historical figure. So it's very, again, more strong circumstantial evidence that Christ was a historical figure.
All right, thank you, Deacon Scale. Yes, I do take the point, and as you said, Josephus is a very important character. But, I think what makes me even want to dig more is the temptation to say that because Josephus was a Jew, he also might have some bias towards Abrahamic faith and a narrative that is there. Some people might say Josephus, based on these insertions, many people not knowing the additions were not done by him might say, he's a Christian and therefore he has some biases. So it makes me want to dig a little bit deeper to see if there's anything outside of the people or the nation of Jesus. Because, Josephus being a Jew would have also come from the same bloodline, so to speak. So we have another historical reference. This one is from Tacitus, once proconsul of Asia in the Roman Empire. So here he's a Roman historian, and he was one of the officials that was hostile towards Christianity. He was born in 64 AD. This is also shortly after Jesus died. So we have two things going through this reference so far. He was hostile towards Christianity. He was born in 64 AD. He was also a historian and somebody in the Roman Empire. This is outside of Christianity or any Jewish nation or any, any lenience towards or leaning towards Jesus. Now, in his manuscripts, the Annals, which he wrote in 109 AD, he makes a reference to Christos. And we know that in Greek, Christos means the Christ and is definitely in reference to the Messiah. So his reference says here, hence to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with guilt, and this was talking about Roman Emperor Nero, charged with the guilt and punished Christians who were hated for their enormities. Christos, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. So here we have Tacitus, Roman historian, born 64 AD, very close after the death of Christ, very close to that time period. And we're seeing that he's making reference to Pontius Pilate, the crucifixion of Jesus. It's a brief reference, but nonetheless, it does give some credence to the fact that there was somebody called Christos, that was crucified, put to death, and especially by Pontius Pilate, where we know that the Gospels also reference. So here we have a Roman non-biblical reference. He's non-Jewish. He is born closely after the time of Christ. In his writing, he's making reference to Roman political actions that speak to the crucifixion, the founder of Christianity and the followers, and also the fact that there's a reference to Pontius Pilate there. We also have other references from other persons. So the main points that I'm going to take away from the reference from Tacitus and from Josephus is that we have somebody named Jesus, the Christ, who was crucified by Pontius Pilate. We know his name to be Jesus, as Josephus would have told us. We know that he was called Christus, crucified by Pontius Pilate, as Tacitus would have said. We know that he had a brother called James. We know that he won over both Jews and Greeks. We know that the Jewish leaders of the day expressed unfavorable opinions about him. We know that Pilate rendered the decision that he should be executed. We know that his execution was by crucifixion. He was executed during Pontius Pilate's governorship. So we have these two historical documents, one outside of Christianity, but still within Jewish history. And we also have a Roman reference outside of Christianity, outside of the Jewish nation, also giving some reference to Christus and his crucifixion. And these activities or events that are being referenced also seem to correlate with the Gospels in terms of specific names, specific circumstances, and both of these authors would have existed very close to the time of Jesus. Their writings would have been done very close to the time of Jesus, even more closer, as Deacon Scale will have pointed out, for Julius Caesar. Any comments by you guys on those two references?
Yeah, very important. You argue that you might want to dig deeper beyond Josephus, but again, for me, I think because of the antagonistic relationship between the Jews and the I really would more see a hate relationship. I would really more see, and again, you can even think about it in terms of our contemporary relationship. I mean, it's getting better, but even certain relationship between Jews and Christians, there is an antagonistic relationship that exists, and so it would be more, what do you say, I guess more reason would exist for Josephus to say that, listen, this man did not exist. I mean, you argue that, well, he's a Jew, a brother, but no, we again, listen, this man is a rebel, this man is a heretic, this man is blasphemous and he should be put to death. So I don't see any level of reason for Josephus because he's a Jew. I think because they're both Jews, he would have more reason to want to reject Jesus for what he did. But again, because of the integrity that he had to record his existence. And as I said, the Roman Tacticus, very important, non-Jewish. So even if we want to take that angle, very important because a so-called Gentile writing about this man, again, in Roman province, very important as well. But I guess but one of the things we said earlier, Ray, is that I think there's and Scale, but on the point more, there is an undue emphasis in trying to prove the historicity of Jesus, and it is really not needed in terms of his existence. So I think those two really, as far as I am concerned, really do not even need to go beyond those two people, because in truth and in fact, I don't think it's that. I mean, again, because as I said, there's sometimes a Christian bias, there's an anti-Jesus bias, so but I don't think we need to go beyond that. I'm not easily convinced. So I do believe that this is sufficient in the same way how we would have any other historical figure that we barely have enough evidence for and say, yeah, man, such a person existed. I don't see why Jesus' existence is so controversial.
Yeah, understood. Deacon Scale, any quick comments before I move on to some other scholars?
Yes, Josephus, just a bit more historical context. He was the son of a high priest. So his father was Matthias, and he was a high priest in Jerusalem, right in the time that right after the death of Christ. So this is someone who would have come face to face in the battle between Christianity as a new Jewish sect and the establishment, right? The established order. So as Josephus would have been somewhat antagonistic in that sense towards Christianity. So he had no reason to be writing and supporting the existence of Christianity. So I think that as well helps us to the context. He actually fled from Israel and went over to Rome, and it is believed that he wrote the Antiquities from there.
Yeah.
In Rome after he fled from Israel. It's actually believed that he was kind of more going towards a more Roman thought move. In fact, a lot of his writing is antagonistic towards Judaism, incidentally. Right? So he seemed to have had some falling out with Judaism of sorts, and he was chastising some of the actions of the Jewish establishment in his writings.
Okay.
So I think we can accept Josephus. And outside of the existence of Christ, he is accepted as a credible source of information about all things Judaism at the time. So we really have no reason to doubt his credibility in that sense. And Tacitus is one of the most revered historians in Roman history. So again, these are very credible by historical standards, authors making reference to Christ, and we cannot discount that their accounts at all.
Yes, no, thank you for those points, but the people still want more. I think the people still want more.
Yeah.
So, we're coming down to a close soon, but I'm just going to give you a couple more of what Christians do have as references outside. So you also have another Roman governor around 112 AD, once again very close to the time of Jesus, Governor Pliny the Younger, he is called, another well-respected historian. In his letter to Emperor Trajan, referred many times to Christ and Christians who had turned away from him because they were threatened with death. He notes the Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ. So certainly he is making reference to that they're followers of Christ, very close to the time after Jesus died. So it seems to us that there was a set of persons who believed also that there was a man called Jesus, and him being another Roman citizen and a person of very noble and also well-known and well-respected historian noting there as well. We also have from Syria, this writing by, and forgive me if I don't pronounce the name right, Marabar Serapion of Syria, writing between 70 and 200 AD from prison. He said, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime. What advantage did men of Samos gain from burying Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. And here he notes, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished, making reference to 70 AD here, an expulsion of the Jews. Once again, we have a Syrian writer from prison commenting on the fact that the Jewish king existed and the Jews were abolished or thrown out of their land. So we have several references of different persons talking about Jesus, referencing his followers, referencing the circumstances out of which he was, crucified. We have the time markers in terms of a lot of these writers were very close to the time of Jesus, between 37 AD to 120 AD. Three of them at least being born within that time and being historians and also writing about what was going on at the time. And I point to this fact that historians weren't present at the time that Jesus existed. That's not how historians work. Historians usually are tasked with the job to go and dig up the past that would have existed before. So the fact that there's no historian that existed in Jesus' time is perfectly okay, because the historian would not have done the investigation until after the event is done and to verify the sources. So, for me, and, I'll give you guys the chance to have some final comments, but if we look at the Bible in terms of the eyewitness accounts, the copies of the Gospels, copies albeit, but the closeness to the fragments to Jesus' time, even closer than those, as Deacon Scabler points out about Napoleon, the fact that there are different details from the different points of view of Jesus' existence. Also, Luke himself being a historian, Acts of the Apostles is very much a historical writing. And the account in Luke also a very historical writing. So Luke himself was a historian. So we have the Jewish historians who were Christians. And then we have the historians outside Josephus' time. Deacon Scabler brought up Matthias, his father, who certainly would have passed on the knowledge of a Jesus existing and being crucified in his time. So, Josephus didn't have anything to contradict this view that Jesus existed. Certainly his father would have told him that there is no such man, if that was the case. So we have Josephus also writing. We have Tacitus also writing outside, Roman historian once again, very close to the time of Jesus, talking about the fact that they were Christians and there was somebody called Christus. And we have other references from different persons acknowledging that there's a man called Jesus and the death that he met and the way in which he met that death. And this definitely is cross-referenced in the 4 gospel accounts. So I mean, if this is not enough evidence to at least say that Jesus existed, we can get to the miracles and whether he's God later, but to at least say that he existed by any historical standards, certainly less historical standards exist for Julius Caesar and others. But to say that he existed, I mean, for me, it's overwhelming. I can't, I don't need anything else. If I was not convinced before, I'm even more convinced now after this research and definitely the facts. Any closing thoughts from the panelists?
Skip.
Yeah, I agree with you, Ray, that the evidence for Jesus' existence is overwhelming. In fact, it's a minority of serious scholars who have done the work who would even counter this, because this is generally accepted within biblical scholarship. I mean, I'm not just talking about Christian scholars, I'm talking about skeptics and so forth. It is almost unanimous that Jesus as a historical figure exists. What is more contested is the resurrection, right? That is a more contested point, and the reliability of the Gospels, whether the accounts of his life were true, and the specific details about what would have happened, and of course his claim that Jesus is the Son of God. Those are things that you have more debates about or more contention about, but certainly the existence of a man called Jesus in the land of Palestine almost 2,000 years ago is almost unanimously accepted, and we have the evidence, whether the biblical accounts, whether it is the independent sources. I think we can be satisfied that Jesus as a historical person is a fact.
All right, Jonah, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just going back over all the things that we have said, I don't think we have to go very far. And again, I want to emphasize the necessity of removing the thought about the New Testament and it can't be reliable because it's a theological text, because indeed when you take them as they are historical books, independent writers writing, it is very important that we see that way, outside of it being inspired, outside of it being a holy text, independent writers corroborating, and again, as you've mentioned, corroborating with so-called extra biblical sources. I just think it's overwhelming, and again, I said about 3 times before, there is an undue, it's unnecessary that we would have to have a discussion like this, because I really didn't, I've heard, but I really did not thought much of the arguments against Jesus' existence. I really just think it to be another, just some anti-Christian, anti-Jesus thing. And again, you bringing out some of the arguments just goes to show that the arguments that are out there, at least in this regard, I mean, as Scale said, there are more controversial things that can be addressed, the resurrection, which definitely requires more time and more attention. But something as basic as the existence of Jesus, I think we could have, without sounding arrogant, we could have taken, we didn't have to take this much time. Because it's just an existence. It's just whether or not a person existed. But thanks be to God, as he said in the comments, that we do have, if the New Testament is not enough for us, we do have those sources outside of the Bible. By all canonical sources, by all authoritative historical methodology, we can use them, and we come down to decide that if we use the same metric to assess the historical figures, using that on Jesus, we come down to decide that Jesus himself, Jesus of Nazareth, did existed.
All right, thank you, Jonah. And just a final comment or question from Nat D. Are there records of the birth and death for people that lived in that time, and perhaps his early parents or his disciples? So just to note that it was not commonplace, and I think that is a part of the problem that we have with the records for Jesus. It was not commonplace that people in poorer parts of society or who weren't as noble would have had a lot of things recorded about them or historical records being kept. So it wouldn't be uncommon for his parents or his disciples not to have any birth records or anything written about them, so to speak. But the fact that Jesus, being from a poor area, and the fact that he was actually referenced, even gives more credence to the fact that Jesus did exist. You know, you can't ignore the evidence that is out there. Well, that is all I have for today. I thank everybody for listening. I'll turn back over to Deacon Scale to just close us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Ray, for the research and the time that you put into this presentation and this discussion. I'm sure that our audience will have benefited from it. I certainly benefited from going back over this, help to strengthen our faith, because from time to time things do come that cause us to question. So it is important for us to go over these things and to be able to prove all things, test all things, so that we can stand up to the scrutiny, unwarranted as it is in this case, that may be brought against our faith. As Peter said, be prepared to give an answer to those who question our faith. So thank you for joining us, all our audience from all across the world, and we will see you again next week. As well. Next week, actually, we won't see you next week. Next week we will have our monthly prayer and testimony meeting, but we come the second Monday in the month of May, we will return with another Bible study topic. So until then, of course, there's Sabbath services this Saturday at 1 o'clock. Please remember to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel so that you can be notified whenever we have any content, any videos coming out. I want to thank you for your support and your time. You take care. May God bless you and keep you safe as we go through these times. Good night.
Yeah, good night.